Okay, let's move on to chapter 14. Chapter 14, the ANS or autonomic nervous system. So what's the difference here between somatic versus autonomic? Somatic receives sensations that we can perceive and motor functions that we control, except for reflexes. And sometimes you can control reflexes. Some reflexes you can control, other ones you cannot. So that's somatic sensory and somatic motor. Autonomic receives sensations that we do not perceive, which would be visceral sensory. And that's actually not part of the autonomic nervous system. And sends out motor commands that we do not control. So mostly to cardiac muscle, smooth muscle, and glands. Right? So it's really visceral motor is the autonomic nervous system. And there are, somatic nervous system. Here we have, remember in somatic motor, if it's a command coming from the brain, there's two motor neurons involved, remember? Upper motor neuron, starting in the motor cortex down to the spinal cord, and then a lower motor neuron that in the upper motor neuron synapses with the lower motor neuron goes out to a skeletal muscle, for example. In a reflex, like in a somatic nervous system here, so you have somatic sensory, something touches you, something touches you, you get somatic sensory information, goes in through the posterior root into the spinal cord, and then you get a motor neuron coming out to skeletal muscles where you move in response to that. Okay, in the autonomic nervous system, or visceral motor, there are always two motor neurons in response from the spinal cord. So, so it's different from the somatic. The somatic motor, there's two neurons, one's an upper motor neuron, so it's in the brain. But the two neurons in the autonomic nervous system start in the spinal cord and go out to a peripheral ganglion. Here we are, visceral sensory detects similar within blood vessels and smooth muscle and viscera. That goes in to the spinal cord, again, through the dorsal root. And then the motor response, the visceral motor. So here in the spinal cord is the cell body of what's called the preganglionic motor neuron. And it goes out through the ventral root into a sympathetic chain ganglion through the ramus communicans. Here's the ramus communicans. This is a white ramus, and that's a gray ramus. The white ramus is because those fibers are myelinated. The postganglionic axons are not myelinated. But anyway, so the postganglionic cell body is going to be in a ganglion, which remember is a cell body outside the central nervous system. In the sympathetic nervous system, they're closest to the spinal cord. In the parasympathetic nervous system, they're close to the organ that's being innervated. That's one anatomical difference between these two parts of the ANS that we'll get to later on. So this is preganglionic autonomic motor neuron, and it says ganglionic. It should be postganglionic. It's after the ganglion. Transmits nerve signals to smooth muscle, cardiac muscle, and glands. All right. So, visceral motor system, visceral effector, smooth and cardiac muscle, gland, as we just mentioned. Constant stimulation to regulate contraction, not to initiate or terminate. There's always a certain amount of visceral motor going on. Most of your smooth muscle in your body is like partially contracted. Particularly in blood vessels, it's all has to be partially contracted. And so you don't really start the contraction or terminate the contraction, you regulate it. You make it more contracted or less contracted. And it's involved with visceral reflexes, maintenance of blood pressure, for example. Like in blood vessels, the more you dilate peripheral blood vessels, the lower the blood pressure. The more you constrict them, the higher the blood pressure. And we got the two divisions of the autonomic nervous system, the sympathetic and the parasympathetic. Sympathetic prepares body for action. Parasympathetic prepares body for inaction. But be careful about this. That doesn't mean that the sympathetic nervous system turns everything on in your body and parasympathetic nervous system turns everything off in your body. No, the sympathetic nervous system turns on your brain, your lungs, your skeletal muscle getting ready for action, and inhibits GI tract and the urinary system, because it's really an emergency response system. And in an emergency, you're not going to be stopping to grab a bite to eat, and you're not going to be stopping to pee or defecate. You got to deal with this emergency, okay? All right. The parasympathetic prepares body for inaction, so it'll make you. So it turns off heart, lungs, skeletal muscle, or tones them down, even tones your brain down a little bit, but fires up your GI tract. This is called the arrestor. Sympathetic is fight and flight. Parasympathetic is rest and digest. So now the things you need for action are turned down. Things you need for digestion, GI tract, and elimination, urinary tract, is turned on. So they turn off and turn on different things depending upon whether you're going to be not being active or being active. Okay, so one anatomical difference is the parasympathetic division is called a craniosacral division, because the preganglionic neurons, their axons leave from either the cranial region or the sacral region. So in brainstem nuclei or segments of the spinal cord or sacral sections of spinal cord, rest and digest response brings body to homeostasis. Or sympathetic is often called a thoracolumbar system because its preganglionic axons leave in the thoracic region or the lumbar region. It can go up into the cranial region and down into the inguinal region, but it doesn't have, but the preganglionic axons are not leaving from those regions. The postganglionic axons will leave from sympathetic ganglia in those regions, because you have sympathetic ganglion all up in the cranial region and in your inguinal region. You just don't have any preganglionic axons leading to them from those parts of the spinal cord. Activate in emergency situations, fight or flight response, also involved with homeostasis. Okay, so both divisions are always active, really. It's called autonomic tone. To a certain degree, both systems are active, depending upon how active you are or inactive you are. One, maybe more sympathetic if you're active, and then less parasympathetic. When you go to rest and digest, and your sympathetic goes down and your parasympathetic goes up, like a yin and a yang. So remember, neural pathways, two motor neurons, pre and post ganglionic. And there's difference in the length of these pre and post ganglionic, which we're going to get to. Neurotransmitters, there's a difference there too. In the parasympathetic nervous system, it's all acetylcholine. That's it for pre and post. For sympathetic, it's acetylcholine released by the preganglionic axon terminals, but it's usually norepinephrine for the postganglionic axon terminals. Although there is some acetylcholine in post, but only a few. Most it's norepinephrine. Okay, so anatomy I've already mentioned is sympathetic thoracolumbar because its spinal nerves leave from the thoracic or lumbar region. And here's the difference also. Parasympathetic division, here's a preganglionic neuron, preganglionic cell body of the preganglionic neuron, which is going to be in the spinal cord, either in a cranial nuclei or in the sacral region of the spinal cord. And it's a long preganglionic axon that leads out to an autonomic ganglion that's close to the organ that's being innervated, like the vagus nerve is a big parasympathetic nerve, and it innervates the heart. So its axon leaves from a cranial nuclei, goes down to the heart, and there's a small ganglion, autonomic ganglion on the surface of the heart, and that's where the cell body of the postganglionic cell is. So then the preganglionic deposits acetylcholine onto the cell body of the postganglionic neuron, and then its axon leaves that ganglion and innervates the heart. All right. Sympathetic, completely reversed. The preganglionic neuron cell body is in the spinal cord, either in the thoracic region or lumbar region. It has a short preganglionic axon, and it's branching. It branches from the sympathetic preganglionic neuron, and it goes to an autonomic ganglion, usually really close to the spinal cord, the sympathetic chain ganglion. Although there are other ganglia a little farther away called prevertebral ganglia that may go to. And that's where the cell body of the postganglionic neuron is. And it's going to release acetylcholine, the preganglionic axon terminals release acetylcholine on the cell body and dendrites of the postganglionic cell body. And then the axon of the postganglionic cell body leaves the sympathetic chain ganglion, either through a gray ramus or through another exit, and then the postganglionic axon is quite long. It goes all the way out to the organ it's innervated. So we give the example of the heart. The heart's innervated by both the sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous system. So if sympathetic output to the heart will leave somewhere around the thorax region, go out to a sympathetic chain ganglion, and then go into a sympathetic chain ganglion, innervate a postganglionic cell body. And that postganglionic axon will leave the sympathetic chain ganglion and go to the heart. Okay. So the autonomic ganglia are in different places for the two systems. Okay. And the length of the preganglionic and postganglionic are different. Okay. So here is parasympathetic, and you'll see how many organs are innervated. Many organs are innervated, and most of these will also be innervated by the sympathetic nervous system. That's called dual innervation. Like I mentioned, the heart gets both. Most organs actually get both. There's a few exceptions. One big exception is blood vessels. We'll get the blood vessels, that they're only innervated by the sympathetic nervous system. And the adrenal medulla is only innervated by the sympathetic nervous system. So here are all these cranial nuclei in the brainstem, and there's the long preganglionic axons in that greenish color, and then there are here's little ganglia here on the heart and on the lungs, on stomach and liver and intestines and testes, ovaries, uterus, bladder. They're all have small ganglia right on the surface of the organ. And then notice the in blue are the postganglionic axons, and they're usually really short and they're unmyelinated. Okay, so long preganglionic axon, short postganglionic axon. And it's all acetylcholine here. Acetylcholine released by the preganglionic axon terminals and the postganglionic axon terminals. Here is the sympathetic nervous system. So here's all these chain ganglia. See, there's even chain ganglia up here and down here, even though there's no preganglionic axon going into them from the spinal cord. So here in brown are the preganglionic axons, and a lot of them are pretty short, and they're going to innervate a subbody of the postganglionic neuron in the sympathetic chain ganglion. Sometimes it's a little bit longer when they're going to the celiac ganglion and these intervertebral ganglia, they're called. They're a little farther on. So it's the preganglionic axon sometimes is a little longer. But then here are the postganglionic axons going to all the same organs pretty much the same organs as the parasympathetic did, but they're very long. And they generally release the norepinephrine. So the postganglionic sympathetic axon terminals generally release epinephrine. The preganglionic axon terminals release acetylcholine. Okay, so sympathetic short preganglionic fiber to ganglia near the CNS, long postganglionic fiber. Fiber is the same as axon. All right. 3 routes. The spinal nerve route, pre to the sympathetic chain ganglion, and post to effective via ventral ramus. And it goes up and leaves to a gray ramus. And then a sympathetic nerve pre to sympathetic chain ganglion at a different spinal cord level, post ventral ramus. And then the splanchnic nerves pre to collateral ganglion via splanchnic nerves, post to effective. So we're going to go over this in the autonomic nervous system lab activity. We're going to do a group activity where we're going to trace these different sympathetic routes. So you get so these become a little more clear. And there's a figure in the book, I should put the book with me, that you'll use in lab to figure out these routes. Well, there they are, right? This is the figure right here. So spinal nerve pathway, things like the sweat glands. So you have the preganglionic axon coming out, going through a white ramus into sympathetic chain ganglion, and then going up to another sympathetic chain ganglion farther up or farther down, innervating the subbody of the postganglionic neuron. And it is going to go out through its axon is going to go out through a gray ramus to things like sweat glands and blood vessels. Sympathetic pathway comes out and goes into a sympathetic chain ganglion, and either synapses on a subbody in that same sympathetic chain ganglion, or goes up or down to another chain ganglion, and then leaves through another exit route. It doesn't leave through a gray ramus. Then a splanchnic nerve route. The preganglionic axon leaves, goes out and goes through a sympathetic chain ganglion, but doesn't synapse on a cell there. It goes straight through and goes on to what's called a prevertebral ganglion out here. And then that's where this subbody, the postganglionic neuron will be. And then that postganglionic axon will leave and go to the organs being innervated. So that's like the small intestine. Then the adrenal medulla route is unusual in the sense that it follows the same exact route as the splanchnic pathway, but it goes right through the prevertebral ganglion and right on to the adrenal medulla. So this is an exception. There's only one motor neuron in this pathway. There's 2 in all the others. There's 1 in the adrenal medulla pathway. And it's because the postganglionic cell in the adrenal medulla pathway are really anaxonic and axonic neurons. The adrenal medulla is really neural tissue. It's a neuroendocrine tissue. So they're neurons that don't have any axons, and all they do is secrete. Okay. So there's that special adrenal medulla, preganglionic fiber to adrenal medulla via splanchnic nerve, no postganglionic fiber axon. Okay, so we already know this parasympathetic craniosacral, long preganglionic, short postganglionic, and ganglion tardigrades. We've already gone over that. So comparisons of parasympathetic and sympathetic divisions. Function. Parasympathetic maintains homeostasis, conserves energy, replenishes energy stores, rests and digests. Sympathetic prepares body to cope with emergencies, releases energy. Fight or flight division. Location of preganglionic neuron cell bodies, brainstem and sacral region, spinal cord, thoracic spinal cord, and lumbar spinal cord. Okay, length of preganglionic axon, long, a few branches, short, and many branches. Length of postganglionic axon, short, parasympathetic, long, sympathetic. Location of ganglia, terminal ganglia close to the target organ for parasympathetic, sympathetic trunk ganglia, or paravertebral ganglia, which are much closer to the CNS. Rami communicates, the parasympathetic nervous system doesn't use the rami communicates, but the sympathetic does, with the white rami and the gray rami. And degree of response, local response. Usually it's a local isolated response for parasympathetic. Sympathetic can have local response, but sometimes it has a what's called a mass activation, stimulates many organs at the same time. And that's because the preganglionic axon has collaterals, has many collaterals. Okay. Neurotransmitters, another difference. In parasympathetic, so remember, both the preganglionic axon terminals release neurotransmitter, and the postganglionic axon terminals release neurotransmitter. In the parasympathetic nervous system, both neurons release acetylcholine. In the sympathetic, the preganglionic is cholinergic, acetylcholine, but the postganglionic is cholinergic or adrenergic. Remember, adrenergic is norepinephrine, choline is acetylcholine. And there are some cholinergic, but there's only a few of them. Like cholinergic in eccrine sweat glands, adrenal medulla, blood vessels, and skeletal muscle. Those are cholinergic. All the rest of them are adrenergic. And some are actually nitroxinergic, secrete nitric oxide. Okay, so these neurotransmitter receptors fall in different categories. It's actually much more complicated. We're going to just go into a couple categories for acetylcholine, and that is nicotinic receptors and muscarinic receptors. So nicotinic, all skeletal muscle, postganglionic neurons, adrenal medulla. It's always excitatory, opens ligand-gated ion channels, binds curare, which is the poison arrow frog, poison arrow frog toxin. And it's named because nicotine binds to it. Muscarinic is named because some kind of fungal compound connects to it. They're found on cardiac muscle, gland, smooth muscle, and they work via a second messenger system. It binds atropine. So they're a little slower because they go through a second messenger system similar to what systemic hormones, water-soluble systemic hormones go through a second messenger system. You remember bind to a G protein, activate the adenylate cyclase, and make cyclic AMP. So here we go. Parasympathetic pathway. Acetylcholine by the preganglionic axon terminals, the postganglionic cell body and dendrites have nicotinic receptors, and the postganglionic axon terminals release acetylcholine onto target cells that have muscarinic receptors. Sympathetic, it's usually over here. They release the preganglionic axon terminals release acetylcholine. There's nicotinic receptors again on a cell body and dendrites of the postganglionic neuron, but usually norepinephrine is secreted onto adrenergic receptors. And there's two types of adrenergic receptors. We're going to get to that too, A and B. But sometimes in sweat glands, blood vessels, and skeletal muscle, the target cell has muscarinic receptors, which are acetylcholine, and the preganglionic, the postganglionic axon terminals release acetylcholine, even though this is a sympathetic system. Okay, so alpha and beta. Norepinephrine, adrenergic, usually works by activating and suppressing second messenger system, and there's two types of receptors here. Actually, there's a lot more, but we're not going to get into those. There are subtypes of subtypes. But alpha receptors in the piloerector muscles, which give you goose flesh, dermal blood vessels, intestinal smooth muscle, GI smooth muscle, different subtypes. Okay. Beta are the bronchioles, cardiac muscle, smooth muscle, skeletal muscle, arteries, and the different subtypes of it also. And autonomic, remember autonomic tone, smooth muscle in blood vessels. Remember, the smooth muscle in blood vessels is always partially contracted, depending upon what the blood pressure is. If it wasn't, your blood pressure would practically be zero and you'd be dead. So, as I said before, sympathetic affects more widespread mass activation because the preganglionic fiber, preganglionic axons are branched. Okay. Innervation, dual innervation. This means the organ is innervated by both branches. And a lot of them have antagonistic effects, like heart rate. Parasympathetic innervation slows the heart rate. Sympathetic innervation raises the heart rate. GI tract. Parasympathetic activates the smooth muscle in your GI tract. Sympathetic tones it down. Pupil diameter. Sympathetic relaxes the pupil dilator, so your eyes dilate, and sympathetic does the exact reverse, makes the ciliary muscle constrict, and it decreases the size of your pupil. Sometimes it's cooperative. Salivation, both work together to allow you to make saliva, but the sympathetic nervous system causes saliva to have more mucus in it. So that's when you're scared or upset or something, your mouth feels dry, not because you're not making saliva, but you're making a more mucousy saliva. Okay, and male sexual function. I think the parasympathetic nervous system is needed to get an erection, and the sympathetic nervous system is needed to help in ejaculation. So they work together in male sexual function. Some things are only have single innervation, and it's really sympathetic. Adrenal medulla, sweat glands, piloerector muscles, and most blood vessels, single innervation. That's it, just the sympathetic nervous system. So how can you have, two opposite effects, a constriction and dilation, say, of a blood vessel, if it's only innervated by one of the two branches? Well, sympathetic activation usually constricts blood vessels. These are alpha receptors. Constricts blood vessels, say, in your GI tract. But I think there are beta receptors in your heart, and so it causes the blood vessels in your heart to dilate. And so actually, the sympathetic nervous system causes a dilation. And that dilation is just you relax the smooth muscle. I mean, if you relax a smooth muscle and blood vessel, the blood pressure inside will push it open. So that's how you can have a contraction and dilation with just sympathetic innervation. I was going to say something else here. Oh yeah, and in blood vessels in skeletal muscle, for example, remember, they have actually cholinergic receptors, and that causes them to dilate. The sympathetic nervous system will dilate blood vessels in your heart and in your skeletal muscle, and it makes sense because that's what you're going to really be needing if you're getting ready for action. Autonomic reflexes. Remember, cardiovascular reflexes. Once you start exercising, your heart rate automatically goes up, right? That you don't have to think about it, right? Gastrointestinal, you eat something, your parasympathetic nervous system fires up. It fires up the smooth muscle in your GI tract, and it gets activated all by itself. And micturition and defecation, automatic. Well, there's an automatic part to it, right? You have internal and external sphincters on both your anus and in your urethra. And the internal ones are automatic. It's a complete autonomic reflex. And that's when you feel, oh, I gotta go. But fortunately, the external sphincters are under somatic control, and you can decide when to relax those and do it in an appropriate time and place. That's why infants, they don't know how to use their external sphincters, so they're on complete autonomic reflex for peeing and pooping, right? Okay. So what controls these reflexes, right? And there's central control, cerebral cortex, particularly the limbic system, hypothalamus, and also the hypothalamus is a primary center for visceral motor control. There's all kinds of nuclei there that sympathetic and parasympathetic that control all kinds of homeostatic functions. Brainstem, particularly nuclei in reticular formation. That's where you have a lot of cell bodies that go out, cell bodies whose axons go out through the cranial nerves, and spinal cords. Some visceral reflexes carried out by branches of the ANS right in the spinal cord. And there it is, right there. Cerebrum, conscious activities in the cerebrum affect hypothalamus control of the ANS. So like fear or anxiety or something coming from the limbic system can affect the hypothalamus. Integration control command center for autonomic functions involved in emotions. Brainstem contains major autonomic nervous system reflex centers. Remember, there's cardiovascular center, there's the blood vessel controls vasomotor center, controls smooth muscle and blood vessels, and is the breathing center. Of course, that's somatic. Then spinal cord, ANS reflex centers for defecation and urination. Those just go right into the spinal cord and back out to the anus or the urethra to open up the internal sphincters. So all those areas, that's all central control of autonomic function. And I think that's it for this video lecture. Yes, it is. So, stop sharing. So that's it. So it's going to be 203 ANS 1, and it's the only one because it's a fairly short chapter. So we're done with autonomic nervous system. And we'll have an autonomic nervous system lab quiz that's going to be all online. So let's stop here and we'll catch you some other time.